This is the Balancing Act by Security Compass, your guide to going fast while staying safe in today's digital world. Today we are joined by Altaz Valani from Security Compass and Spencer Koch, security wizard at Reddit, to discuss the role of security in application modernization. In today's digital world, businesses have to modernize their applications routinely. In this podcast, we will discuss current trends and security challenges around application modernization and how security can help minimize the risk. This is important as many organizations are currently transforming their applications against a backdrop of going digital.
Hello, everybody, and welcome once again to our podcast today. Our guest is Spencer Koch. Spencer, thank you once again for joining us. Appreciate it.
Yeah, sure.
So, Spencer, we hear a lot today about app modernization, and this really has a lot of nuance attached to it, but I'd like to open this conversation up by asking you, are you seeing any trends around app modernization?
Yeah, so I think certainly in my experience, I've seen two different paths. I've seen the app modernization where you are lifting and shifting because you want to get into the cloud and you've got some sort of driver to get there, whether that be a cost reduction or you've got legacy crumbling architecture and infrastructure that you're trying to get off of and you think the cloud is the place to be, or you've actually got like dear and earnest, like we need to do a digital revolution, we need to modernize, we need to make this platform into something that actually is in the current decade. So those have been and I've had experience with both of those paths, and both of them come with their own interesting security challenges.
Let's just dive right into it then, Spencer. What are the security challenges? When you take a look at app modernization, these are challenging. So why don't you tell us, what are you seeing? What have you seen?
I think the major challenge here is around the bulk of the change. And each company is going to be different and have their own risk appetite for how quickly they want to do these cloud migrations. If I take my experience at my prior energy company, that was get everything in the cloud ASAP. And ability to do application security or even just like regular old security testing is a very limited window. And so we came up with a different approach, which was light testing. Let's try to figure out what we can, make sure we can at least adopt best of breed hardening and do some like the basic blocking and tackling, which questionably may have never been done in the past. And so that was the trade-off of we're not going to have data flow diagrams of every single system that moves up into the cloud, but we can at least find the major things and lift and shift, and maybe we'll come back based on risk-based approach, and we'll figure out which apps should get more involved testing in their new cloud home, or maybe they're okay where they currently are and we don't need to test them ever again. So it was very much up to, let's say, risk-based approach, how much money and time and hold up, because security testing is always unfortunately seen as a hold up, balancing those three to figure out how do we make that migration successful. That was one major effort.
Yeah, interesting. I'd like to get to the security risk question but just for now, if we can just dive a little bit deeper on what you had mentioned, because I think when we talk about modernization, from what you've described, it's not really a clean cut. It's not like we go in and one day we've suddenly moved over to this new application or even infrastructure. And you're doing this piecemeal and you're gradually migrating this application over. And in the midst of all of that, you've got to think about the data, you've got to think about new security models, maybe in the new platform that you're using. How do we integrate in the interim, all of these things? So can you talk a little bit, when we talk about the challenges, did you find that the security teams had to be involved at all stages or during the migration and during the modernization effort itself?
So I think had to be and were are definitely two different things. I think it would behoove any person to understand the context of the app that they're trying to defend. And so should they be involved? Yeah, for sure. Are they typically involved? That's a harder challenge. And I think it is also complicated by the fact that some of these apps, they may be well documented. They probably are not well documented. And so doing things like understanding data flow diagrams or even just like network protocols from the old to new system can sometimes be a bit of a disaster to try to figure out what actually is old to new. And in those cases, like you run into other interesting security challenges that's not even like trying to secure or do data governance, or how can we make sure that like the OAuth or the OWASP top 10 aren't included. Like it's things like, how do we make sure that the network access controls aren't overly permissive because we have no idea what protocols this thing's supposed to be talking on. So it can range from everything from something as simple or like the old school traditional security type challenges to more modern, okay, how are we actually going to do authentication within this app? And do we need to rebuild it using OAuth 2 or something that's more modern like that? I think that's the challenge is, does that company have an appetite to do more than just a lift and shift? And I see that's kind of, it depends on the volume of things that are being modernized, the importance of that app. If it's financial in nature, maybe you'll get more leeway to help make sure it's truly modernized and includes a good security bit. If it's lift and shift, then you're, from a security team's perspective, you're gonna be fighting a lot of battles just to get any information out of that one.
Interesting. So let's go into the risk side then. How do we minimize the security risk during app modernization?
Yeah, this one's tricky too, because it comes down to a lot to what do you know about the app? And so I mentioned like documentations might not be there, et cetera. If you have information around how to put that app into context, then that follows a very familiar security risk management model where the crown jewels are, what the potential attack surface is. That's a good tried and true type model. I think the other challenge is that as things are moving to cloud or to new modern type architecture, maybe you can get away with doing some ring fencing, right? Like you throw everything up into a VPC in AWS and you say no external access. That's the draconian route that we're going to go. I think it's very tricky because a security person normally doesn't have all of the knowledge of how this thing works. And so it's just making those calls with the kind of the same security controls that we've typically used in the old world of before the app was modernized. It's the same types of concepts. The terms might just have changed. So instead of having like an actual physical firewall that did something, now you're talking about AWS security groups and how are you going to secure from that perspective. So
interesting. Yeah, it's interesting because what I'm hearing is in this context, security is actually should be an enabler if the business has decided that they want to modernize the app, what can security do to play a role in facilitating that migration from the legacy system over to a modern system? And without getting in the way, what are some of the things that would be acceptable and radiating what the risk is so that everybody is very clear that if we go down this path, here are the options, but not being perceived as the blocker, which is often the case. Spencer, in this whole realm of application modernization, then we've already in just a short time touched on many different topics, everything from the different levels of security to the involvement, even to the different risk opportunities that exist. Is there anything else that you would like to add for the audience around application modernization that you think is like a burning point that we haven't talked about?
Yeah, I think the thing that can often hold up security folks is that it sounds like change is bad, things are happening that aren't quite quantifiable, and there's a FUD of this thing's moving and it's changing from what's current stance. I think the thing that kind of gives me hope is that most of our new platforms have security baked in. I look at all of our web frameworks that used to exist, like .NET frameworks from 10 years ago, are extremely different from the types of web frameworks that we might be using nowadays. That include things like CSRF protection, cross-site scripting protection. All that stuff is normally built in and baked into the actual framework itself. So there is extreme value in modernizing to a platform that already has all of that taken care of, rather than trying to glom on all these different point solutions that we might have had to use in the past, or crazy incantations that we would have to do to harden an app. And so I think that's really a saving grace. Being able to get on a modern platform with a well-documented, like it's in the 2020s of, we know how this thing works, it's been reviewed, it's got good security controls and making sure that those are enabled. That becomes less of a, well, is it designed, did my developers build it correctly, to more of a, am I using this component correctly? And that's a much easier conversation to have. And it takes definitely not nearly as much time for a security team to review that type of stuff. And so I think those are major wins for us. It's because we can get away from the having to slave through every line code review into, if I just need the bare minimum, are we using all of the features? Do we pick a language and a framework that includes these things by design? And we're using those rather than having to build from scratch.
Wonderful. That's fantastic. And that takes us into the whole discussion around security architectures. Maybe we'll come back and talk about that. Spencer, thank you very much for your time. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you.
Can't get enough of the balancing act? Make sure to check out our website at www.securitycompass.com and be sure to subscribe to our channel for more episodes.